So I did a rewatch of Macross Zero today. It's only a 5 episode OVA, so I wanted to give my thoughts on it because, you know, I want people to get an honest look at the, like, from someone who understands the lore and doesn't look at each Macross series as its own contained thing and can find the connections between all the different series very easily. And people treat Macross Zero with the same kind of, forgetfulness. They tend to forget about it in the grand scheme of things, like they do with Macross 2. And both Macross 2 and Macross Zero, because of them being OVAs, don't get the attention they deserve, I think. And I'm saying this as and this is without even considering Macross Frontier, because most of the stuff that I think Frontier brings, because there's a lot of connections, at least in the TV series of Frontier, to Macross Zero. I think the most important connections are actually a Macross Delta, and it's, rewatching Macross Zero after watching the Delta TV series over again, which I'm going to do a review of that one too. The connections there actually, I think, are more important to the entire lore of Macross than it is with Frontier. Even though Delta actually has some very, very important direct connections to Frontier. But that's beside the point. This is about Macross Zero. Now, Macross Zero takes place in 2008, the year before the first Macross begins. It's the end of the Unification War, whatever you want to call it. And the main character is Xing, and there is a love triangle between him and the sisters Sara and Mao Nome. Mao Nome being important to everything that happens in Macross Frontier, and also being the grandmother of Cheryl. That I think when it comes to the visuals in it, I'll do the basic stuff first, and then I'll go into the more lore stuff. The visuals, even I've read some interviews in Japanese about from Kawamori himself, like when they were doing the CG for Macross Zero for the battle scenes, they were done so well that he even said that they could never replicate those that level of CG ever again. And I have to admit, the CG in Macross Zero, outside of the Tori no Hito, is impeccable. Like, I hate CG in all this stuff unless it's like mixed in correctly with, you take hand-drawn stuff and you mix it in with the CG, and I think it works better. Kind of like Macross Plus in that sense. But recent Macross is nothing but CG, and I'm not very happy with that. But outside of the one thing, I think the CG in Macross Zero holds up extremely well. The battle scenes, they're not as fast-paced as, say, Frontier or Delta. I think that kind of goes with the fact that they're using Valkyries that are prototypes, basically, for what's going to come next in, like, the original Macross, like the VF1s and stuff like that. And they're not going to be nearly as fast or whatever as, stuff like a Durandal or whatever, which is like 50 years later. But the CG holds up really well. I think the characters were done really well. They have, there's a lot of backstory with Roy that, is very, very good. It develops his character extremely well, considering that he dies very early on in the original Macross. Um, I think them putting a focus on him along with the having him as a secondary character to develop him further with Sheen being the main character, I think was a really good idea. Um, I think that the whole I think the story in general, as it's short because it's only 5 episodes, actually shorter than Macross 2. It does what it needs to do. And sure, you might want it to be a little bit longer, but then you would be pushing the story into the beginning of the original Macross, and you don't want to do that. So I think they did the right thing by cutting it off when they did. As for the lore, those probably most people haven't bothered to watch Delta, but Zero, with its connections directly to the Mayan island, and then the connections with Delta with the phrase that Lloyd uses to basically control Mikumo to make her like become, Hoshi no Daite, and like help Windermere and all that other stuff, right? The fact that it's directly connected brings, like, this is something that's had my brain working since I finished watching it, Zero again, is what are the connections between the Mayan people and the Windermerian people? What about these two groups of people, even though they evolved in different ways and evolved completely devoid, like separate of each other, because Earth and Windermere hadn't even encountered each other at this point, because ASS-1, aka the SDF-1 Macross, hadn't even gone into space yet. The fact that Sara Gnome is the she's kind of like the descendant of the people who are trying to prevent the return of the Tori no Hito, and they call her Kaze no Michibikite. Now, and that, of course, I'm using the Japanese words because it doesn't. I don't think it would make sense in English. It would cause confusion if I use the English words. Whereas in Windermere, it's the Kaze no Utaite. So, like, Sara's position is like a guide, whereas like the young king of Windermere, the boy who sings the Kazanuta, he is the singer of the wind. So it's like a guide versus a singer, and there's some connections there that I wish I could like figure out a little bit better. But I mean, Permaculture is going around the universe like screwing with everything and like genetically splicing all kinds of stuff. So they were making all kinds of stuff. Now, to go into a little bit of Frontier lore, to mix with Zero, because they are very closely connected. The Tori no Hito is actually based on the Bajira Queen. The Permaculture had encountered the Bajira Queen. They hadn't learned about fold technology yet, but then when they encountered the Bajira, they actually were fearful of the Bajira. And so when they created Tori no Hito to keep an eye on humanity to make sure they didn't screw anything up, they base it off of that. So that's why Tori Hito can fold and can like float and all this other kind of stuff, because it has like it can control it can like control itself by gravity and like fly in the air and all this other stuff. So it's very much, and it was based on the Bajira Queen. Now, the important thing is that the Tori no Hito is made to keep an eye on humanity, and this is specifically stated in Zero. This is specifically stated in the last episode when Sara gets absorbed into it. The Torinoshito asks Sara, has humanity achieved spaceflight? She says yes. Are they still fighting a war? Are they still fighting each other? And then she tries to hold back without answering, and then he asks again, has humanity stopped fighting? And she says no. And that's when Torinoshito decides, okay, we have to start over. This is the whole purpose of Torinoshito, was to watch humanity, and if they continue to fight with each other, that it was to, its basic design was to wipe out humanity and start over. So, and this is specifically stated in Zero. This is not hidden in any way. This is not in some kind of, like source book or anything. This is specifically in episode 5, at the end of episode 5, what the purpose of Torinoshito is. And it shows how, even for just like this short little thing, how important this series is to the entire lore of Macross. It's not even just, it's not only the lore of, Frontier Delta that gets involved. It's all of it, because this is, if Torinoshito wipes out humanity, there is no ASS-1. It destroys ASS-1. They don't go into space. They don't meet the Zentradi. They don't, end the war with the Zentradi and try to create peace. But it also, this really goes into how the Earth government that ends up becoming the one government that leads after the war with the Zentradi as well. They've been doing disturbing things since before, the Zentradi war. And this connects very much to the fact that they look like the good guys in the original Macross, but, there's that. But then if you look at Macross 7, Macross Frontier, Macross Delta, even Macross 2, the government has basically, like, they commit massive amount of genocide and war crimes and using illegal weapons of mass destruction to get what they want. And they do the exact same thing in Zero. So there's a deep connection to all of the future Macross series to this. And the only one that gets left out is the first one, is because humanity gets nearly wiped out and they're all that's left, really. And it's after that they start to get back into their old ways again. Looking at Macross 7 is a great example of this. Where they decide to use those weapons of mass destruction on the Proto-Devlin and it doesn't work and all this other stuff, right? But, they have consistently broken their word with people. They've consistently lied to people. All this other stuff. So there's a deep thread that runs through this, and that's chronologically starts with Zero, but goes through the entire Macross universe of the Earth government just being, completely incompetent, if not genocidal. So, and this also leads into, why Lady M is doing what Lady M is doing in Delta. Because of, all these things that the government's been doing, and the fact that the events of Macross Zero were covered up by the government until Frontier era. So you have to keep that in mind as well, is that the episode Legend of Zero from the Frontier TV series, actually an extremely important episode that does not, conflict with the canon of the movies at all. It actually supports the canon of the movies. The Legend of Zero episode about them making a movie about the events of Macross Zero, and how and actually connects to the original Macross TV series too with the Miss Macross contest, but that's not here or there. It's that they finally, the Earth government finally admits that these events happened. They don't admit about the Torino store or stuff like that, but they kind of talk about, you know, the existence of Mao Noma and Sara Noma and all this other stuff, which is something that they had been covering up for 50 years. So it's actually a critical episode to watch if you're gonna get into Macross Frontier. Is there like, if like, this is where, you know, Macross Zero, being the fact that it was the 20th anniversary OVA, and how Kawamori has basically based everything off of Macross, like running it through Zero. Because, you know, like, Makina in Macross Delta is the great granddaughter of Nakajima Raizo, who is one of the mechanics working on the VF Zero, and, you know, he's very, very he's not super prominent because he's just a mechanic guy, but he's one of the key side characters of Macross Zero, along with Roy, because now it connects directly to Makina and Delta. I think that Zero, on its own, seems weak at first, but when you take it in, like, the rest of Macross, this is the key thing about Macross, is that, like, sure, you can watch a single story and you can enjoy certain characters within the confines of that story, but the problem with Macross is that it's all connected, it's all interconnected, and especially when it, like, because 7 and Plus came out before Zero, like, you know, like, actually were released before Zero, the connections are a little bit less there, but and the same goes for 2, because the only thing before 2, all you had was flashback in the first movie and the first TV series. But that doesn't take away from the fact that Zero, I think, is probably lore-wise the most important of all of the Macross. I think, but lore-wise, Do You Remember Love and Macross Zero are the two most, they are the key components to the entire lore of Macross. And I think if you start watching Do You Remember Love, it gives you the basic ideas of protoculture, and then you go back and watch Zero, and then you go ahead and you watch the rest of it, and you go through, like, Frontier and Delta and 2 and stuff like that. Everything makes more sense with Zero as part of the universe. It really, it bridges a lot of the important protoculture lore, and I highly recommend people watch it after Do You Remember Love. If you've never watched Macross before, start with the original movie, and then at least know that Minmay wins the Miss Macross contest, and she beats out this really famous actress whose granddaughter actually plays Sarah Nome in the Legend of Zero episode of Macross Frontier. And also the fact that Max and Miria have a baby, Comedia, and the episode Viva Maria, where they go and where Max and Miria take Comedia to, you know, cause culture shock on that asteroid-based factory thing. That's a critical element to Macross Delta, the second Delta movie. That's a critical side point that's actually that most people didn't get it when they watched Macross Delta Zeta Raibu. I noticed right away when Max made a specific comment and they go to the asteroid. I'm like, huh, I see where you're going with that. So there's a lot of deep lore there, and I think that after you watch Do You Remember Love, and then you keep in mind the certain events from the TV series, not all of them, but just certain events from the TV series, and then you watch Zero, everything will make sense. everything makes sense. And I think Zero is, when people talk about the lore, like the lore channels and stuff on here that talk about, you know, Frontier and Delta, and they go back to a lot of the Zero stuff, but they don't talk about Zero in and of itself. And I think that Zero needs much, 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 much more attention. I agree with, I say the same thing about 2, but I think if you want to get into the lore of Macross and to understand the universe, Zero, you must watch it. Otherwise, you won't get anything. You won't understand the protoculture lore. You won't get into any of it. It's so vital that you understand the events of Macross Zero. And not the stuff about, you know, like the Earth government and the anti-Earth government fighting with each other. That's a side point to, you know, the stuff with Sara, Mao, and Torinoshito, and that stuff is actually the key of Macross Zero. And I think that people, I think everybody who wants to get deep into Macross needs to understand Zero. After watching the Delta TV series over again, and then going back and watching Zero again, Zero is probably, outside of Do You Remember Love, is the most important point of the Macross lore, and people need to watch it. So I highly recommend it. I'm not gonna score stuff. I don't believe in putting scores on things, but I believe it's the everything about Zero. Even with the way it ends kind of weird, which is actually into a lot of theory crafting in certain Japanese channels that want to talk about what's Lady M's purpose. Why hasn't Lady M come out of the situation that she's in? It all of it directly connects back to the events of Zero. Even through the theory crafting, everything connects back to Zero. So Zero and the first Macross. So you need to watch both of those to understand the entire lore of Macross. So I highly recommend you watch it. People may not like it because of the lack of action or something like that. I don't. The action is not what this series is about. The series is about the lore, and you know, I think that's where people misunderstand Zero. And I want people to go back and watch Zero, really absorb it. It will take at least 2 to 3 viewings to really understand Zero. And I think that Zero is required viewing. It's short, so it's not a huge issue. It's shorter than 2, so people should be happy about that. But it's you know, it's easy to watch. But it's very deep, so it takes a couple viewings to really understand the depths that you need to get into to really understand Macross. So I highly recommend it. It is a very good series, but if you like the action side of it, you may not be entirely pleased with it. But if you want to learn the deeper lore of protoculture and to make some connections to other series, it's vital. It's a must watch, and you have to understand it to be able to understand what's going on later. The much later stuff of the Macross universe. Maybe not so much 2, but for Frontier and Delta, it's required. It's absolutely required that you watch Zero. Otherwise, you won't get a lot of the lore stuff involved. And I think for anyone who who really needs, or not needs, but who really is interested in deeper stories, Zero is amazing. I think it's much deeper than I had originally thought, because when I watched it the very first time, I was not happy with it. I thought I was like, what the hell is this? But I think that it's, after watching it multiple times after that, I finally understand it, and I think it's it depends on your perspective, what you're looking for, what you want to watch, and what you like in a story. If you like a lot of action, you probably won't like Macross Zero. If you like a lot of deep story and lore and stuff like that, you'll love it. So I highly recommend people watch it. I wanted to make this video to explain that Zero is actually a really good series, and people need to give it more credit, and people need to pay attention to it more. I wanted to bring more attention to this because there's nobody, I even checked, I did a search, nobody in English is talking about Zero, and I guarantee that any of the people that I've watched who's done any kind of Macross videos, they've avoided connecting everything. And you can't do that with Macross. It's all connected in some way. Even 2 is connected into the other lore of the Macross that I did my Marduk video about. Okay? Think, like, watch Zero, then take a few days to digest it, and then watch it again. Because the first time you won't get it. You absolutely will not get it. I didn't get it the first time. But now that I've watched it, I think 3 or 4 times, I think, it's made a lot more sense. And the last time before this time that I watched it, I did a full Macross marathon at sans, the second Delta movie, because that was still in movie theaters. But I will do a review of that. As I think I did a video about my impressions of doing a Macross marathon. I'll double check, but if I did, please watch that. If I didn't, I will make it. But please watch Zero, and don't take it in a vacuum. Remember that after watching Zero, it will change your perspective of the entire Macross universe. And it will open your eyes to Frontier a little bit more, and it'll open your eyes more to Delta. And so, please watch it. It's a very good 5 episodes. It's worth it. I highly recommend it. So, that's all for this video. I will be continuing. I think my next lore video will be a Marduk video. I'm not sure yet, but we'll see. Anyway, that's all for this one.